Hi, everyone. Welcome to Bloomerang Academy, and thank you for joining us today. Today, we're talking about our QuickBooks Online integration. If you've been using Bloomerang for a while, you may already know that we have a QuickBooks desktop feature, but what we're talking about today is our QuickBooks Online integration. Joining us today is our product manager extraordinaire, Cody Lawson. Hi, Cody.
Hi, Diana. I am in Denver. So the weather here is wonderful, sunny, 75, nice fall day for us. I am a product manager at Bloomerang. I have been with the company for, I think we're almost at, I think I'm at 8 years now. So I've been here since the very beginning, and I've worked in multiple different areas. So if you've been with Bloomerang for a long time, my name may be somewhat familiar either through support. I did conversions for a while. I've done some of our quality assurance testing. I've pretty much done everything except for sales. So I've had a lot of experience with the app, and I'm really excited about this feature. It's been in the works for a while, and I hope that you all enjoy what we have to offer and that it can provide you with the flexibility that you need to kind of streamline your Bloomerang and accounting systems. One other thing that I always want to note is that I'm a big Liverpool fan. You can see there I am with my wife in Florence, Italy. This was 2 years ago, back when traveling was a thing. They did win the championship, English Premier League. However, they were very badly humbled this past weekend. So I'm a little bit upset about their recent performances, but I'm sure that they will come back. One other thing that I think is a requirement, given the current kind of homework situation, is the animal cameo. So this is Oliver. He didn't know he was going to be on camera, which is why he kind of looks a little bit scruffy. He will be groomed next week, so I don't treat him poorly. But he's 12 and a half years old, and he always kind of sits by my side. But unlike cats and things, he's not going to be jumping up during the presentation. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. First of all, got to do one big disclaimer. I am not an accountant. I am not your accountant. So as I go through this setup, I'm going to be talking about the features, the flexibility, the ways that you can set things up generally, how lists and stuff are pulled in. But I am not going to be able to answer specific questions about how your QuickBooks Online accounts are set up, your classes, or the items that you have listed out. If you have any hesitation about how you set up this integration, I would encourage you to talk to your financial advisor beforehand. When you are talking about accounting software, it is very important to get the information correct. So I would encourage you to know what you are doing as you're working through this integration. Okay, so first of all, let's do a quick kind of vocabulary lesson. I'm going to try my best not to confuse the two, but understand that in Bloomerang, we refer to your donors as constituents. On the QuickBooks side, however, they are referred to as customers. QuickBooks is not built specifically for nonprofits, so when we refer to things on the QuickBooks side, we're going to refer to them the same way that if you went into Target, you would be a customer. If you buy something, you would get a sales receipt, those types of things. I think that there are ways that you can actually change that information in QuickBooks. I'm not going to get into that today, but if for whatever reason you want to create some more consistency between the words, I think there's some ways that you can update that stuff on the QuickBooks side. So when I talk about constituents, I'm going to be referring to that on the Bloomerang side. When I refer to customers, I'm going to be talking about that on the QuickBooks side, but those are equal for the purposes of this presentation. Next thing, Invoices and payments. So invoices and payments are things that are on the QuickBooks side. An invoice is essentially like what we would refer to in Bloomerang as a raised amount. So it is something that has been promised to you. In QuickBooks, it would be accounts receivable, but you haven't actually received the money yet. It is something that has been sort of promised to you. So typically that would be like a pledge. On Bloomerang would be something that is sort of promised to you, but you haven't received anything yet, which would be the payment. So the payment on the invoice pays down that promise. Another type of item on the QuickBooks side that we'll be talking about would be sales receipts. And I kind of referenced that a little bit before. When you go into a store, you buy a t-shirt, you go through the checkout, you get a sales receipt. A sales receipt is a more direct reflection of revenue for the purposes of this integration. And both the invoice and payments, which kind of work together as one thing, and the sales receipt are two options that you have with how you transfer the information from Bloomerang into QuickBooks. These last three items, they are related in the sense that this is the way that you categorize information as they get reflected and sent over into QuickBooks. So a service item, for the purposes of our integration, think of that kind of like a substitute for your income accounts when you are using things like a sales receipt. So they are actually tied to your income accounts, and that's the way, because you can't reflect an income with this integration, the sales receipt can kind of operate in that same way. So you could make individual ones, for example, for each campaign, for your membership levels, etc. And then they would still all be able, if you've got a gold, silver, platinum membership level, you could have different sales service items for each of those, but all three of those could still go into a single income account of membership dues. So these allow you to then very specifically track each of the things that you might be fundraising, with quantities, total amounts, and averages for each. I'll kind of show you how some of that stuff works a little bit later. Classes. So these are typically like the category of funds in Bloomerang. So programs, fundraising, admin. In our desktop, in the desktop feature, classes are tied directly to funds. This is a different style of integration than our desktop one. So if you're really familiar with our desktop one, this is going to be a little bit of a different style of integration. But for the purposes of classes, those still pretty much tie to your funds for the most part. And then the last thing is the accounts. Well, when it comes to QuickBooks, everything is tied to an account. You've got your chart of accounts, you've got things like your salaries, your rent expenses, furniture, those types of things are all represented in accounts. The account is the natural financial category of the item. As it relates to Bloomerang, Bloomerang fits within a very small section of your total accounting, the chart of accounts. We are talking directly about the fundraising slice of that chart of accounts. We think that we do that better. We do that very well. We provide you with the most flexibility. So we want to essentially replace the manual effort of entering that information into QuickBooks and instead say, come to Bloomerang, do that here, set up the integration, and allow us to send that information over. So with that, let me do a high-level overview of this feature that we've provided. Let me go through the agenda first. So the agenda, first we're going to do a high-level overview. Then I'm going to kind of walk through the steps of setting up, turning on the feature, setting it up, and then the last thing that I'm going to do is kind of go through and show kind of day-to-day usage. and then we'll leave some time at the end for some questions. And then if Diana or Jessica, if people have questions that are specifically relevant to where we are in that moment, you could chime in if you want, and I can see if I can answer those. Okay, so starting with the high-level overview. Who has access to this feature? All of our customers can use this feature. Now, that doesn't mean that every user has access to this feature, however. Admins, obviously, you have full and complete access. A standard user without access to transactions, to edit transactions, will not be able to really utilize this feature in any way. And then standard users that do have the transaction edit option enabled, they will be able to access transactions that sync to Bloomerang. However, they're not going to be able to access the main configuration, settings, and sync information. We limit that to the admins because of the impact that it can have if somebody that doesn't have the expertise and therefore the user permission level were to have access to it, they could very easily create a lot of unintended consequences. So the next thing about this feature is we want Bloomerang to be your source of truth for your donations. A single point of entry, that helps avoid the pain and the time associated with manual duplicate entry into systems. In addition, by having one point of entry, that absolutely avoids the chances of entry errors and other inconsistencies. Single donations, recurring donation payments, or pledges and pledge payments, they're entered into Bloomerang. And then we can take care of sending it to QuickBooks either automatically, or if you want to have control over when something syncs, you can send it manually. We will automatically handle associating the transaction with a customer in QuickBooks, and we will even update those transactions in QuickBooks if, after they've already been sent over, you need to make an edit in that Bloomerang transaction. You will have the option to resync it during the next sync job and update that information, or if for whatever reason maybe you've already made the adjustment on the QuickBooks side, you could just make then the appropriate update on the Bloomerang side and not have it sync again. So then some additional feature list items. Again, we're talking about a single point of entry and updating. The feature is flexible because it's a rule-based setup, which means if you have a simple QuickBooks integration, you just need to be able to send it over to a single account or class an account. You can do that. But if you have more complexity, you can create rules that allow you to send specific transactions that meet a certain criteria over to a specific account or service item or class, as I referenced earlier. The next thing is we add a layer of financial protection to transactions in Bloomerang once they have either synced to QuickBooks, or if you set those transactions as do not sync, we will also lock them down. This extra layer of protection ensures that somebody who accesses that transaction won't make any changes to the information on that transaction without also identifying whether that change needs to also then be reflected in QuickBooks. Again, we try to keep you in Bloomerang as it relates to your fundraising entry. And then the other thing is being able to set it and forget it. Once you have your rules set up, if you just have a very simple setup and you don't need to maybe update or enter new rules on a regular basis, you can set the rules that you want, set up an automatic sync scheduler, and we will process those syncs daily, weekly, monthly, or if you just want to set it for a specific one time into the future, you can do that as well. And then the last kind of overview feature point is the reporting side. So we have unsynced report, we have a synced report, and we have a do not sync report. And that provides you with the total picture of your transactions before they sync, seeing where they synced, or in the case of some that you maybe don't want to sync, identifying those in a list as well. So we give you the ability to check from all points before and after the sync to understand how your transactions are working with QuickBooks. Okay, so now I'm going to go into a high-level overview of QuickBooks itself. With that, I'm going to jump over here and we'll see if it kept me logged in or not. Looks like I'm still logged in. So the first thing is, the chart of accounts. Again, most of this is not relevant to this integration. The integration is, again, a very small selection of your nonprofit fundraising in your overall accounting needs. So in this case, what I have here, this is just a very generic, this is a template QuickBooks account setup. It's not tailored specifically to a nonprofit. You can see that I put in one account here for contributions as a nonprofit income kind of a thing. Some other things that you'll see here that are relevant though would be something like undeposited funds, and we'll get into that in a little while. But your chart of accounts, and your chart of accounts may also have numbers next to them. A lot of people like to set up account numbers. In this case, I didn't put that in there just to avoid creating any additional confusion. But your setup is your setup, and we're not going to really touch on this any further than just referencing the fact that these are where all of your accounts are. The next list that I think is important for you to understand is if I go into, so the settings, if I go to all lists, there is this list called classes. Couple things to keep in mind. Depending on your subscription level, if you have the most basic, I think it's essentials is maybe what it is, you may not actually have access to classes. That's okay. You can still use this integration even without the classes, but just understand if you don't see this, it may be because of your subscription level. Another thing to keep in mind is, and you can see here, this example one, sometimes you only have up to 40 total. Those would be active, so you can have more than 40, but you can only have 40 that are active. That comes into play if you start to run up against that limit and you're using our integration. You need to have your classes active for a rule for us to be able to sync those transactions over. So you can see here, I just created a number of them, some test classes. There are ways to create subclasses. Those will also be reflected on our integration. But I put in some of the most basic ones that I know of, admin, fundraising. I made one to reference the fact that you might have grants. So yeah, that's the class list. And then the last one here, let me show you the service items. Interesting thing about service items is, so here's where, again, you can reference to the fact that they have an income account associated with them. There is the ability to reference a class value for a service item. This will come into play later. We have this option where your service item and class can be linked. We will be able to pull this class item if you utilize this feature. This is something that I think you have to turn on. If you don't see it when you go to create your list of service items, the access to that, I believe, it's always buried, and I always forget exactly how to get there, but it's in kind of, I think, your accounts and settings in one of the main areas here, maybe under, let's see if I can find it really quickly. Under advanced, yeah, so you can turn on tracking classes, and I think that maybe that's where they put it. That will put it in the service item as well, but if possible, it might be in another area. So short version is, if you don't see a class linked on your service items and you want to do that, you can check the help documentation for how to enable it. The last thing that I'll show you very quickly is the reporting section. One of the reasons why utilizing the service items and classes is valuable with this integration is we have reports in QuickBooks that actually can reference things like other expenses. So if you are doing a golf outing or something, there are going to be expenses associated with that that aren't reflected in the Bloomerang side, but are reflected in your accounting software. So if you are tracking your fundraising with the golf outing, you can pull that information in using these service items and classes, and then run certain reports, profit and loss by class, and those will be able to show you how that golf outing performed as far as bringing in money versus the expenses of that event. When it comes to things like the products, the sales, the service items, one thing that's nice, and I kind of referenced to the fact that you've got, maybe memberships. In this case, I haven't sent anything over with these, but there's a quantity associated with those, so you can see how many gold members you have, how many silver members, and then it shows an average donation for those as well. So that's another area that, if you start to use the service items and classes on the QuickBooks side, can provide you with, and some additional information about your different programs and things. All right. Let me pull this back over here. And so now what I'm going to do is go through the actual setup in Bloomerang. So this is, I've been alluding to it this whole time, but now I'm actually going to show how to get in there. Sorry, pulling in different tabs and different windows. So here's your Bloomerang screen, your dashboard. Under the settings menu, so again, this is admin only access. So you would need to have an admin. You come in here to the settings icon, you view all settings. You go to your My Organization page, and if you scroll down here, you can see that we now have this QuickBooks Online option that you can select. Once you select it and you hit Save, what we will do is we will add in to the slide out this QuickBooks Online link. Once you click into that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to disconnect just to show you what it looks like. You'll be presented with this initial setup wizard. You click the green button. It's probably going to shortcut it a little bit for me. Yep, so typically what you would see is, if this is the first time you're connecting, there will be kind of a fairly regular screen when you're connecting with multiple systems, where it says you agree that Bloomerang can access your QuickBooks stuff and QuickBooks can access the Bloomerang stuff, and then you need to agree to that. Once you click that you accept, we will return you back to this page. You'll see that your QuickBooks account is connected. And then you'll be presented with this other information. Again, these are all selected because I had previously connected, but what you will notice is that all of these items are required. The first thing that you're going to be asked for is how you want your transactions to be mapped into QuickBooks. The first option here is to have things coming over, everything coming over as invoices and payments. Now, if you set these up as invoices and payments, what you will see is for every single donation, or in the case of recurring donation payments, you will have two items created when it's synced over. You will have an invoice for the amount and then have a payment immediately applied to that invoice. When it comes to your pledges and your pledge payments, the invoice will represent the pledge. The due date on that invoice will be the last payment date that you set up in your schedule. And then every payment on that pledge will go and pay down the invoice total. So you'll have one payment for each individual pledge payment on that schedule. And then, like I said, with the recurring donation payments, while we keep those separate as types, the effect is the same as with a single donation. We can't represent the recurring donation schedule in any way. In QuickBooks, there isn't an instrument to reflect that. So recurring donation payments essentially operate the same way as individual donations do. If we do it as sales receipts, so when something is entered in a sales receipt, as a sales receipt, again, it's a single entry this time. So when you have a donation, we reflect a single entry for that donation. Where this gets complicated with pledges and payments is because a sales receipt is essentially revenue, immediately received revenue, there's no way to reflect the pledge, which is the promise of a certain amount of revenue, but not actually receiving the revenue at that time. So if you set all transactions to be entered as sales receipts, the difference here is that pledges, the pledge itself will not sync, but all of your pledge payments will come over as individual sales receipt entries. And then the third option is potentially you want to customize your transaction setup based on the transaction type. I referenced all three of these: donations, pledges and payments, and recurring donation payments. And you can mix and match. Now, the one thing that I would caution you against, you certainly can do this. However, because we are talking about potentially syncing things over as different types of entries in QuickBooks, when it comes to things like converting payments, converting donations to a pledge payment or a recurring donation payment, you need to keep in mind that there are some limitations that we may have with how we can update those transactions on the QuickBooks side if you are mixing and matching those types. So we encourage you to try to keep it consistent if you can, but again, you know, your setup may have certain requirements, and we offer you that flexibility should you want it. The next thing that you'll see here is, do you want it to have pledge write-offs synced to QuickBooks, and then do you want refunds to sync to QuickBooks? Obviously, if you don't have pledges syncing over, the write-off is not going to sync. However, if you do have a pledge that you write off, and so a pledge would come in as the invoice, say it's $60 for the course of the year, monthly installments of $5. If they've paid off $30 of that, but then you write off $30, what we will do is send over a credit memo, which allows you to reflect that $30 of unpaid pledge as bad debt. With refunds, these are simply sent over as a refund receipt for the transaction that was synced over. And you have the choice if you want to enter those in, whether you want Bloomerang to sync those over, or if you would rather handle that manually, you have that flexibility. The display name here in QuickBooks, you have your customers. The customers all have a display name. That display name has to be a unique name for all of your QBO customers. This feature, this option here is important in one way. You may already have your Bloomerang constituents entered in as customers in QuickBooks. You may have been doing double entry, and you may have been reflecting your constituents as customers. We do a very limited duplicate matching. when we sync over the transaction for a constituent for the first time. If the display name matches exactly and the primary email, in QuickBooks, the email field is just a string where you can separate them by different, by commas. If the first email in that email field matches to the primary email and the first and last name, or in the case of the org name, if the org name matches exactly to the display name, we will link that constituent in Bloomerang to that existing customer in QuickBooks. If it doesn't match exactly, we will create a new customer and start associating the transactions that we sync over subsequently with that new customer. I want to give you one important note of caution. If we create a new customer in QuickBooks when you send over your transaction and you have a duplicate that already existed, but our limited duplicate matching didn't pick it up, if you are going to merge those two customers, please merge the already existing customer into the one that we create, because we've created a specific link to that customer account. If you merge the customer we create into the other customer that you already had established, that link will break and the transactions will remain unsynced until that link is re-established. So again, any customer that we create when we send over transactions, keep that customer and instead merge the other one into it, and everything will continue to operate without any break. Next step is the mapping and the rules section. Now you'll see here I've already added a number of rules. That's because setting up this presentation required a lot of work beforehand. What you will typically see is this custom mapping will be empty, and the only thing that you'll need to enter in is a default mapping. The default mapping, the account is required, so you at the very least have to enter in an account, but then you also have the access to the service item list and the class list, and you can set up any custom mapping rules that you want. The important thing to keep in mind about this page, the hierarchy is important. Transactions in Bloomerang, think of them kind of like a coin sorter, where you drop your coins in and they travel around until they find the specific slot or the specific rule in this case that they match to, in which case it will get caught by that rule. So if you have a transaction that is in kind, but you also have a transaction, that same transaction has gold membership, it's going to hit the first rule here. So when you create your rule hierarchy, make sure that the order of them is based on the order in which you want those transactions to be caught. What you'll see here, I've started a new rule. We have 5 different filtering options for your transactions in Bloomerang. If you select more than one thing, so if you say unrestricted and the appeal is, direct mail, both of these have to be met for the transaction to be caught by the rules. So these are, if you're familiar with our reporting system, these are and filters. So fund is unrestricted and appeal is direct mail. And then you identify how you want the transaction to map over to QuickBooks for that rule, and you can select your service item class, and at minimum, you have to select your account, or you can identify it as a do not sync, in which case, these transactions won't go over. You have the ability to move the rules around. You can obviously go into an existing rule and edit it if you need to, or delete the rule. I'm not going to do that right now. But I think that covers pretty much everything on the rules page for right now. I will show you some of how these rules work in action in a minute. So after you've gotten through your mapping and your rules, the last step is selecting a sync start date. So the sync start date is important because it is the date on or after which transactions that have a date, from that point forward, they are subject to syncing. So in this case, I set my sync start date as September 1st, 2020. Before then, I had potentially already entered in all the transactions in Bloomerang on the QuickBooks side. Or I've already closed my books and I don't want transactions that exist in Bloomerang prior to that point to come over to QuickBooks. So the sync start date is important. I would encourage you to consider how you want to identify that. You can set it as any date you want. So if you want to do your entire database, you can. If you want to set it, for 1/1/2021, you don't want to start syncing stuff over until the beginning of next year, you can do that as well. And then the last setting is the sync type. So we have manual and automatic syncing. If you have already used our scheduled reporting feature, you will notice that this is a very similar thing. You can set up an automatic sync based weekly on a certain day, and you can select from various 15-minute increments if you want, or you can simply do manual syncing. If you set it to automatic syncing, you still have the option to manually sync whenever you want. So once you've got your setup in the way that you want it to be, you can set it to automatic and be done with it. All right, so now I'm going to show you sort of the day-to-day use in QuickBooks. Really quickly, I should probably just stop and pause for a second to see if there's anything that I covered too quickly, Diana or Jessica, that I should maybe take another second for.
Thanks, Cody. Just kind of reviewing the mapping rules that you can take a look at, or the custom mapping rules. So you can set mapping rules for fund, campaign, appeal type, and method. This does not include custom fields, correct?
That is correct. While we would like to provide you with unlimited flexibility for how you can filter, at this point, it is only those main fields that you can filter on, and those fields are the ones that we will lock down when a transaction is sent over to ensure that you can still edit your custom fields and other items on the transaction, but those filtered fields are going to be locked to ensure the consistency between the two systems.
Wonderful. And when you select a sync start date, is it possible to select a date in the past, or what are the potential dangers of selecting a date in the past?
Yes, you can select a date in the past. You could theoretically set the date to where every single transaction that you've ever entered into Bloomerang would be subject to syncing. So while you've got that flexibility, that's also the warning. Once you set that sync start date and you run a sync job, if you have 150,000 transactions, we will start to sync 150,000 transactions. So you need to understand at what point, if you were already entering stuff in twice on QuickBooks and in Bloomerang, understand when you're going to stop entering stuff in on the QuickBooks side and allow Bloomerang to enter that in for you.
Great. Thanks, Cody.
All right. Okay, so after you finished the wizard setup, this is sort of your main everyday page. And what you will find out is you've got your existing rules, which hopefully you don't have to edit or move around a bunch. You will maybe have to add a new rule if, for example, you start a new campaign, or maybe you have a new appeal that you send out that you want to send over to a specific new service item. But this page generally reflects that step 3 in the wizard. You can add a new rule, and then the settings menu, which gets added in after you're done. This contains all of your previously selected settings. So you can, in theory, you could disconnect your QuickBooks account. You could change from manual to automatic syncing because for the first few times you wanted to make sure that it synced over the way that you wanted, but afterward you said, okay, now I can do a daily sync or a weekly sync. And perhaps maybe you want to stop manually syncing, or you want to start manually syncing refunds. These options are available to you after that. Keep in mind that we automatically save these. So if you move a rule around, it is automatically saved, and we update our lists that you can select every time this page is loaded. So if you add a new class, if you add a new service item, we will refresh that list every time you access it. So the other thing that's important on this page would be the transaction reports. As I mentioned, I set the sync start date to September 1st. If I open this unsynced report, what this is going to do is bring in all the transactions that have a date on or after September 1st that are unsynced. And I'll show you here. If I go to a transaction, you will see that we add a QuickBooks status. And unsynced is the default for all transactions, including transactions that exist before the sync start date. They simply will not be included in the sync because we run it based on that sync start date. But the default QuickBooks status is unsynced. There are three others. There's sync in progress. You will probably rarely see that status just because it only exists while a sync job is running. And then we will have synced, which means the transaction has been sent to QuickBooks, and do not sync, which means that you specifically excluded that transaction from going to QuickBooks. There are also some that receive the do not sync status based on limitations with QuickBooks. So for example, QuickBooks does not allow us to create a $0 donation. So in that case, that transaction will simply be reflected as a do not sync. Same thing with pledges. If the pledge exists before the date to begin syncing, but the payment exists after the date to begin syncing, and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of all these different timing things, but the payment will sync over because it exists after the sync start date. But what we will do on the pledge is we will change that status to do not sync because of the link that those transactions have with one another. We need to put the financial control on the entire set of transactions. Coming back over here, what you can see on this unsynced report is how the transaction will sync over based on the rules as they existed at that specific time. It's important to note that the unsynced report is unique compared to other reports. Please only access that report by going through this workflow. Because your rules can change, because your lists can update, we have to run some additional processes at the moment you click this unsynced report. So in order to ensure that we are presenting you with the most accurate and up-to-date information, view your unsynced report by going through this workflow, and it will maintain the level of consistency that you want. So as you can see here, I've got some transactions. Some are set to do not sync. In this case, this is an InKind gift. Some other ones are going to go to different service item classes and accounts. And what I'm going to now do is I'll go ahead and run a manual sync. You'll notice here that we put in a buffer. There's a 24-hour buffer. If a transaction has been created within the last 24 hours, that transaction will just stay unsynced if you were to run a sync job. The reason we did this, after talking with a lot of different customers who want this feature and talking to accountants and some other things, we've noticed that that 24-hour window gives you a good break point where accidental entries tend to get resolved. The majority of the errors get resolved within 24 hours. So we put a buffer in there to give you a little bit of time to ensure that the transaction is right before we would do something like send it into your accounting system, which may have bigger ramifications if the information is incorrect. I'm going to go ahead and sync it now. And so you'll notice that the sync started. If I come back to this transaction, if I refresh it, it might show that the sync is in progress. Like I said, it's pretty quick. So we didn't even get to see that the sync is in progress. What you'll notice now, these fields, the date, the amount, fund, campaign, appeal, the method, these are all locked down. We want to ensure that you don't edit this information without intending to and updating the QuickBooks side should that be necessary. So if I come back over here and I view my unsynced report now, you'll notice that I have no results. I'm going to go ahead and view the synced report. What we reflect here on the synced report is what is actually written for that specific transaction. So you'll notice that on 9/2, Cody Lawson gave $250, and here were the service item classes and accounts. If I come over here and go to the customers, and I pull up Cody, and I go to the transaction list, you will see there was that $2.50 invoice with that payment made. Oh, that was the 9/31. Here we go. $250 on 9/2, and then the payment for that invoice, so it's closed. If I jump back really quickly to that entry, again, you'll notice that we've got the transaction locked down. If I need to make an edit, I go here, I enter in a reason because I want to, and then I have to decide whether I want to set the transaction back to unsynced or if I want to leave it as synced. In this case, I'm just going to leave it, and that way I can show you how a refund would work. So if I click refund, you got to enter a reason. You hit update. It's processing. So now that refund has been entered in. If I come back over here and if I refresh, you will see that that refund would immediately sync over. So here we go. Here's a refund receipt. And if you look at the entry, you'll notice that we referenced the fact that the refund was for a specific entry on that record. So the refund is for the payment number 2165. Let's see, is there anything else that I can show you right here? Oh, I can show you the do not sync report. In this case, I only did not sync a couple entries. The reason that you may not want to sync something over, for example, InKind Gifts, many times people don't want to sync over InKind Gifts. So I created a specific rule to not sync those over. You can still reflect those in QuickBooks. Typically, those are done through journal entries, but we don't have that functionality built into this integration. So you should, if you need to be able to reflect InKind Gifts, and those InKind Gifts don't have a specific amount associated with them, in this case, this one does, but if they were $0 InKind Gifts, you would probably need to enter those in manually. What I would recommend is doing a do not sync report, and then you could add something like the type, or I'm sorry, the method. And once you enter those in, you could specifically filter those in-kind gifts. You could even schedule that report to be sent directly to your accounting department, and they would then have that list of in-kind gifts, and they want to make the journal entry to reflect that. So we give you a lot of flexibility. The feature itself is, I think, really robust, but there are always going to be some limitations, and there are some complexities. So as you are setting this up, if you have questions, our support team is always available to help. And I'd be happy to try to answer any questions right now if anybody has anything that came up.
Cody, can you talk a little bit about a little bit more about the matching between Bloomerang and QBO? Like, do they need to have emails entered in QBO in order for the initial sync to match the accounts in QBO with the constituents in Bloomerang, things like that?
Sure. So we do a very light touch on the customer side. The important thing is that there is a customer that we can associate these transactions with. And without diving too deep into the differences between our desktop integration and this one, the desktop integration completely skips the customer side of QuickBooks Online. It is intended to be more what's known as the lump method. And in the slide deck that we will send to you, there is a resource to some TechSoup YouTube videos that an actual accountant goes through and talks through different setups. He references the lump method versus what is essentially like duplicating our CRM in QuickBooks. But because we use the customer side for this integration, when we create the customer, we'll create the display name, we will populate the constituent information in Bloomerang on the QuickBooks side. However, we are not going to continually update that customer, and we are not going to do very detailed matching from a duplicate matching perspective. I touched on that earlier. If I bring QuickBooks back over here for a second and come back to that customer account. Let's see how quickly it loads up. We do, again, try to match the display name with an existing customer account. So if there were a customer details, you'll see that this customer that we created, the display name is Cody Lawson because we went with the first and the last name. In Bloomerang, it was set up as first name Cody, last name Lawson. We'll try to match that first and last name to the display name here, and then we will look for the email here matching to the primary email in Bloomerang. If those two items match, we will connect the Bloomerang constituent to that existing customer in QuickBooks. And that's the only time. We intentionally kept it very limited because it's much worse for us to associate a constituent with the wrong customer than to create a new customer. Or at least that was the rationale behind the limited duplicate matching. So we wanted it to be limited, and we wanted to be essentially very sure that they were supposed to be linked. And then you'll see that we display some other stuff like the phone number. This might be a little bit weird that it says, question marks, but that's probably because I set up the employer to be question marks. It's my demo database, so I do a lot of weird stuff, you'll see. billing address, Congo. So we do some limited amount of information that we populate on the customer side. But once that information is established and the link to that customer is established, you can go in and update that information, edit that information. There's some reasons why you may want to send specific receipting or other communications out of QuickBooks. We aren't going to touch that again. And so you've got the flexibility to then manipulate it how you want to.
Also, Cody, if people are trying to match up what's in the deposits, like if they are using a batch deposit approach in QBO, I think we can group reports to by account or by method to show the totals, like the dollars that would be associated with those potential deposits by date, correct?
Yeah, so in the synced report, or in the case of maybe a do not sync report, because maybe if they're entering in as a lump method, they don't want to send each individual transaction over and associate it with a customer. You still have all the flexibility of our reporting system. And you can see that we've added in a number of columns. So you can see the QuickBooks Online status, the service item, class, account, and then the last sync date. If you want to bring in the last sync date, and then in this case it's going to be limited because I've only had the one sync that I just ran. But, maybe I have run it before. I think I have run it before, but changed it around. So what you would see here is you could group by the last sync date, and those would get their own individual total sections. And so you could probably use that, and you might be able to then, or you could group it by the, you could set your filters to a specific date range that you sent the last time you updated the bulk entry or the lump entry. You could filter it by that date, and then you could group it by the transaction method. So if you wanted to do credit card entries, you could pull in the method column and then group by that column as well. Again, you've got the full flexibility of our reporting system available to you with these reports. With the one caveat being, again, that the unsynced report has some specific things that are unique here, where the service item, class, and account values that you would see in this list would not actually be stored anywhere else. So you wouldn't be able to filter specifically on those in the same way. And of course, I'll mention that another resource that you have available to you is our great support team. They can help you craft that report. Again, you can schedule that report. If you have an automatic sync and you run it weekly, you could also have an automatically scheduled report for this specific thing that you could have sent to a specific individual that would maybe help reconcile the information between two systems.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cody, for all of that great information. And thank you, everyone, for all of your questions. I know we still have a couple of outstanding questions, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time. We'll make sure to follow up via email for anyone whose questions we didn't get to today. But I hope that gives you a good idea of how to connect your Bloomerang account to your QuickBooks Online account and start using it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you.